So I'd like to begin with an excerpt from a book by Neil Postman called Technopoly. Technopoly is a state of culture. It is also a state of mind. It consists in the deification of technology, which means that the culture seeks its authorization in technology, finds its satisfaction in technology, and takes its orders from technology. This requires the development of a new kind of social order, and of necessity leads to the rapid dissolution of much that is associated with traditional beliefs. One way of defining technopoly, then, is to say it is what happens to a society when the defenses against information glut break down. It is what happens when institutional life becomes inadequate to cope with too much information. It is what happens when a culture, overcome by information generated by technology, tries to employ technology itself as a means of providing clear direction and humane purpose. Sound familiar? MC. We didn't practice that. Postman made up the word technopoly, but maybe you can gather from these quotes what it means. It's meant to designate a stage of society where technology is no longer just a means to a specific localized end, but is instead much more powerful, much more pervasive. In fact, it starts to rewire the circuits of a culture. In the book Technopoly, Postman argues that some of the consequences of this rapid dissolution of traditional beliefs also brings about the silencing or the deauthorization of those institutes we've built in our society to cope with all that information. So, for example, when an abundance of information out there starts purporting to be news information, the traditional journalistic enterprises, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, can't cope with all that information. And so in the flood of it, their voices are silenced and their authority questioned. Now, of course, having free access to a great amount of information is not in and of itself a bad thing. But what Postman and others would have us recognize is that there's an inevitable trade-off between having all that information available to us and having the ability to regulate it. 20 years ago, he wrote this book, and at the time of writing, he thought American society was the only example of a technopoly. And I think if we take stock of our present state of affairs, we'll agree that the rapid dissolution of much that we used to call traditional beliefs is in fact happening. What do we do in the face of that observation? There are two responses we might take. We might take a passive stance. We might say, look, this is just the natural evolution of technology. It brought us to this post-fact place. Let the information tide roll on. Or we might take an active stance. We might begin to make decisive steps to think about, long and hard, how we engage with this influx of information. You know, I said we have a passive choice, but I don't think we actually do. Why? Because when there's so much information available through technology, as there now is, that no individual, no one person, can sift through all of it, we start to make decisions on a daily basis about what information to let in and what information to shield out. And we're carrying out these filtering processes in an unprecedented way. And we have to do it to succeed in our culture. We start to curate for ourselves, in other words, a particular story about the world based on that subset of information we chose to let in. Regarding news information, I heard a journalist recently call this creating the daily eye. So if we're going to be active in filtering all this information because we don't really have a choice about it, let's just own it. Let's be responsible and start to cultivate good practices for engaging with all this information. And I think awareness of these different filters is the first step. But I want to suggest 3 other tools or lessons from philosophy of science, surprisingly maybe, that might help us on our way navigating this new state of affairs. Now, why philosophy of science? I am a philosopher of science, so it's what I know. And for those of you who've never heard of this discipline before, it's easy. It's just a branch. Well, it's not easy, but I mean, it's easy to explain, right? It's a branch of philosophy that uses philosophical tools to investigate science. So we're interested in questions like, what is the nature of a scientific theory? What are laws? What's a good explanation? Are we really connecting with reality? Are there values in science? And the like. The other reason I'm taking these 3 lessons from philosophy of science is because it's a field that studies another field that has demonstrated a lot of success sorting out a potentially infinite amount of information about the natural world. Science is good at what it does, and so somehow it's figured out practices that help it choose between the good information and the bad, and separate the signal from the noise. Okay, so what are these 3 lessons? One, I think, is retaining facticity, or fact, as a guiding star. Second is adopting a critical versus a dogmatic attitude. And the third is reliance upon expertise. So first, facticity. Science is supposed to describe behaviors and patterns in the natural world, and we think it does a pretty good job of this most of the time. And when we ask ourselves why it's good at that, usually our answer has something to do, at least intuitively, with the idea that science is good at what it does because it's somehow latching onto reality. It's tapping into truth. So there's some link between the data of observation and facts in the world. Now, of course, the nature of that link is an arena of vigorous philosophical debate. But for our purposes, I think it's sufficient to say that very few people claim there's no such link at all. So there's some tie in science between facticity down here in the world and the practices of science. I think in the information deluge in which we find ourselves, we've lost clarity about these concepts of truth and fact, and we've lost the importance of there being a tie between information that claims to be factual, that is, has true content, and other indicators of truth. So veracity, testability, maybe that other sources confirm or corroborate that instance of information. Right? We just need to rethink about the role that truth or fact plays in all this information. Okay, facticity. Second thing, the critical versus the dogmatic attitude. I don't think it's any big secret that scientists or philosophers or academics of any sort for that matter think it's better not to be dogmatic about a particular body of information, like a scientific theory, but instead to be critical of it, to hold it in different lights, to test, poke, and prod, and look at it from different vantage points. That's just what it is to do good science. If somebody's overly in love with their pet theory, and they won't listen to new evidence, and they won't entertain other possibilities, they're not being good scientists, they're not acting with integrity toward their field. Well, I think we've seen ample evidence in recent times that when people dogmatically stand on the pile of information they've picked for themselves, breakdown in civil discourse happens. Real fracturing in society, we see this. One way to start healing that, perhaps, is to be a bit more critical about the kinds of information we take in. And that means letting in challenging things that are not comfortable to you or to your own worldview, but nevertheless looking at them all with a critical eye and an eye toward truth. All right, third thing, expertise. Now, it's tricky to say exactly what scientific expertise consists in, but we have a general idea of what it entails. So, for instance, if somebody claims to have made a scientific discovery, but they don't have any of the hallmark characteristics of expertise, maybe they don't belong to an institution that's credible, or maybe they don't have a track record of proven success in a particular field, or the right kind of training, or something like that. We don't disregard what they say, but we do need to scrutinize it carefully. That's why the peer review process is crucial to good science. You need other experts to weigh in on new information. Now, I think this reliance on expertise is equally important in a technopoly, and maybe you can guess why. If no one individual can accurately and with a critical eye toward truth gather all the information out there, it's just impossible, and the amount of information is not likely to decrease anytime soon. If we can't do it, then we need to export or outsource some of that curatorial process to someone else, an expert. And maybe experts in the right field for that body of information. Now, why do I stress this relevance issue? Well, I read a Gallup poll from June 2016 that said, of Americans aged 18 to 34, over 15% were using social media as their primary news resource. Now that's worrisome because social media, for all the good things they are not accountable to, responsible for, or primarily in the business of journalism. Now, to be fair, some of the people being polled may be going to social media to get links to legitimate news sources. But that's still a problem, because we now know that there are algorithms being employed by these social media to tailor specifically to a user what she sees based on her own predilections, her own past preferences. In other words, there are dogmatic filters in place. So we need to rely on expertise, and expertise of the right sort. So there are the three things. I think it's undeniable we are in a technopoly. But instead of being passive in the face of all that noise, all that information, I think we can actively start to cultivate better practices for how we engage with this influx of information. And from philosophy of science, I've said maybe 3 ways to start moving forward are by keeping facticity as a lodestar, by adopting a critical versus a dogmatic attitude, and by relying on expertise. And it's my firm belief that if we do these things, we can start to bring to bear our own faculties in adjudicating this massive information. And we can start to reclaim firm ground for civic virtues and for the institutions that traditionally have